Hey, it's Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to pick up with Unit 11, Lesson number 7, Two Americas During the 1950s. In Lesson 6, we talked about the prosperity of the 1950s and how Americans, of course, made more money than they ever made before. And then because of that, they had more kids, were able to buy homes, start businesses, get involved with franchises. Now, we're going to find that that's going to be not necessarily the case for every American, of course, during the 1950s. And we're going to talk about some of those situations that happened during this Cold War period. All right, the unit focus question is, what effect did the Cold War have on the United States and its relationship with other nations around the world, and describe American prosperity during the post-World War II period? Now, once again, we're not necessarily going to, answer this question now. What we hope is that as we go through these lessons, you keep these questions in mind. What we will do, of course, is go through and address the vocabulary. Now, there will be some academic vocabulary and content vocabulary that we will address as it comes up, of course, in the lesson. But do what we always tell you. Take out your journals, write these words down yourself, and define them yourself. And so you'll have a better understanding of what we're talking about as we go through the lesson. Here we have one lesson focus question that'll be for lesson number 7. It says, which groups of Americans missed out on the prosperity of the 1950s? Now, once again, we said that it was two Americans during the 1950s. One that enjoyed a lot of prosperity, and then there was a part of America that didn't enjoy so much prosperity. And that's where we're headed today. We're going to start with the do now activity. Take out your journals and write down the topic. It says, what factors do you think may contribute to the rise of poverty in a community as others around it enjoy great prosperity? Take a few moments, write this particular term down, consider it a few seconds, and then we'll come right back and find out what you thought. All right, the question says, what factors do you think may contribute to the rise of poverty in the community? Well, it could be access. It could be like in terms of looking at what caused the greatest access for prosperity in the 1950s, of course, was the GI Bill. Everybody didn't have access to the GI Bill. Of course, those people, of course, who were not veterans, of course, didn't have access to the GI Bill. And as a result, they were kind of left on the outside. And even some cases, when you look at minorities, of course, that fought during World War II, their access to the GI Bill wasn't on the same par, of course, as their white counterparts. So we're going to find that the reality of America during the 1950s is that we're looking at two Americas, the haves and the have-nots. And all too often, we're going to find that there are going to be some communities during the 1950s that don't enjoy the same success because of any number of factors, but don't have the same success as some parts of American society. Prosperity denied. Prosperity during the 1950s primarily was enjoyed by the white middle and upper class of American society. The groups left behind, usually through no fault of their own, included inner city residents too poor to move to the suburbs, African Americans that because of societal norms made 51% of their white counterparts earned, Native Americans who were encouraged to leave reservations through the termination policy where they encountered more poverty. The termination policy was an idea, of course, to get rid of the reservations and get all of the Native Americans off the reservation and assimilate them back into American cities and communities. Mexican Americans who were holdovers from the Bracero program, the Appalachian poor whites and blacks who saw coal miner jobs begin to drive due to mechanization. So when we're looking at it, we're going to find that there are going to be a lot of disenfranchised people that don't enjoy the same success as their white counterparts during the 1950s. The rejection of 1950s conformity. Now, as we said now, most Americans raised their kids, of course, in the 1950s, of course, to be like them. To be smaller picture images of what they were. So in looking at it, we're going to find that in the 1950s, there was this idea that everyone should conform and not go against the grain. And we're going to find that that's not going to go over well with some groups. One group that's going to reject this conformity is going to be a group called the beatniks, and we'll talk about them in a few seconds. Many American youth rejected societal norms of the 1950s. That's why they started listening to that rock and roll music. The belief that they should become copies of the parents. The beatniks expressed these ideas in literature and poetry. Movies like Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean, exemplified that rejection of 1950s conformity. The 1950s introduced the rest of the world to the beatniks and the beat generation, which encouraged kids to reject conformity. The same prevailing attitude bleeds in the 1970s with the hippies that come in the 70s. American youth rejection of conformity often resulted in crime, with many adults worrying that society was headed for a crash and juvenile delinquency would become rampant. That's right. In the 1970s, 50s, they thought everything was going to fall apart because because, you know, the youth or young people, of course, were doing their own thing and rejecting the things that their parents and older society, of course, was preaching. Even, you know, same that you can look at any period in history throughout the United States of America, the history of man, and you're going to find that whenever kids reject the standards, of course, that have been set by older people, you're going to find that they're going to believe that the world is falling. And believe it or not, in the 1950s, the world didn't come to an end. In the 1960s, it didn't come to an end. In the 1970s, it didn't come to an end, even though parents were flipping out, thinking that their kids, of course, were going to be the ruination, of course, of the country. Here you have a picture of a beatnik cartoon on the left. Now, remember now, we said that during the 1950s, fedora hats, suits, ties, white shirts, Oxfords, these were the kind of things, of course, that were worn by men. If you look at this beatnik over on the left and look at Jack Kerouac, who is the author of On the Road, who becomes one of the gurus, I guess you can say, of the beat generation, neither one of them is dressed in a suit. And they don't look anything like what other people in the 1950s, of course, looked like. Here is James Dean, one of the lead actors, of course, in the movie Rebel Without a Cause. If you ever seen the Happy Days, you know, sitcom that comes out in the 70s with, you know, Ron Howard, that character Fonzie looks a whole lot like this guy right here. The only difference is you know, Fonzie, of course, has a leather jacket, but that even looks like a leather jacket. So James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause, dies in I think in a motorcycle accident or car accident, a motorcycle accident, never really reaches the potential, of course, that he could have had, because he was supposed to be the next best thing or the next great thing when it comes to acting. Here you have Natalie Wood, similarly dies in the 1980s, drowns, falls off of a boat off the coast of Catalina Island in California and dies, and she was the lead actress in Rebel Without a Cause. Once again, one of those people who didn't get to realize all the greatness that she could have had as an actress because her life, of course, was cut short. All right, lesson focus question. We have one lesson focus question that we want to address, and the question says, which groups of Americans missed out on the prosperity of the 1950s? Well, we gave you an indication. It was all those people, of course, that were disenfranchised to some degree. Inner city residents, of course. We're going to find that the nation's inner cities start a gradual decline starting in the 1950s as white flight starts happening. And what happens, of course, is you're going to find a lot of white residents, of course, move out of the inner cities, of course, and move to the suburbs. And with that, federal tax dollars, of course, move out. So infrastructure is not going to be taken care of as much. African Americans will be disenfranchised a little bit in the 1950s and miss out because they only make 51% of what white Americans make. Coal miners in Appalachia, you know, whether they're white, black, purple, green, yellow, or brown, they're going to lose out too, because we're going to find that these coal mining companies are going to start using machines a lot more than people. And then Mexican Americans, of course, there were holdovers from the Bracero programs, and Native Americans, who at this particular time becomes one of the poorest groups, of course, in America. All right, this is the end of lesson 7 to Americas during the 1950s, and as we said, not everyone enjoyed the prosperity of the 1950s. We're going to find that some groups will struggle. In most cases, not through any fault of their own, but that's just the nature of the way that things were. Now, what we want you to do, of course, is not take my word for it, as I tell you all the time. Go ahead and do your own research and reach your own conclusions. This is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. And with that, we'll see you next time.